My name's Sarah Hardy, and I am the curator and manager of the De Morgan Foundation. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk in the Bleak Midwinter, Symbolic Winter in Late Victorian Art. In today's talk, I will be going through sort of setting the scene for you and talking about the sort of inspiration that the artists that we're focusing on, those late Victorian artists, the pre-Raphaelites, and the artists sort of immediately after them and working at the same time as them, what their inspirations were. So historical winter paintings and some arts and crafts for you as well. And we'll have a look at literature and how that was a great influence to these artists. I've then separated the paintings into my own categories, which helped me sort of look at them and think about why different people were using winter in different ways in their painting. So we have the themes of cold realism, sparkling snow, winter as a woman, and symbolic seasons. So when putting this talk together, it sort of seemed like it was a relevant and good thing to do, to just give you a quick look at how winter had been used before the period that we get to and we're interested in by artists. And something I thought was quite interesting were these absolutely wonderful mosaics that made up a pavement in Cirencester that were discovered in 1849. It was quite big news when they were discovered. And one decorative element of this beautiful mosaic floor was the depictions of the four seasons. So they all have emblems. The one that we're looking at actually isn't winter, it's autumn, which you can see from the wonderful fruit of the harvest in the figure's hair. But that will be relevant later on when we're thinking about this idea of embodying the seasons and making them human and what the decorative benefits are to that. So I thought that was one just to have in mind, and obviously a Roman mosaic. Leaping forward in time, I wanted to share with you the Devonshire Hunt tapestries, acquired by the V&A in the 1950s from the Duchess of Devonshire. These represent French-made tapestries that were made in the Middle Ages, and they are the largest surviving intact tapestries from this time. What I thought was interesting about the depiction of winter in these tapestries is not that it's the central focus. The idea behind it isn't at all that this is depicting a season, or that we're asked to, feel anything about the season as we are in so many other artworks we'll look at today. But it was more the fact that it was there implicitly rather than explicitly in this tapestry, which is of a hunt. So a great upper class social occasion to go off and go on a hunt, but it's a hunt that definitely happened at winter, and we know that because what they are hunting for is bear and boar, so animals that are around at winter. And I just thought that it was quite interesting that winter was implicitly there and implied, because these huge tapestries obviously would have hung on the walls of these great big manor houses to keep them warm. And obviously they're such expensive, such luxurious items that it's almost like there's a premium there being paid for with the how much money there is into having the tapestries, but also the imagery in them as showing something that's a very wealthy pursuit to be able to do. Also, once you've hunted your bears and your boars, it's wintertime, which means that they can be kept in ice and that they can be used to fuel further hunts, further celebrations, further feasts throughout the whole winter period. So actually, winter is here and being used to symbolize wealth, so that anyone arriving at this house has this idea that this great hunt and these great feasts will be going on throughout winter, and this family won't be affected by the cold, as so many families will be in other paintings that we'll look at. Another sort of element of painting that was really exciting to mid and late 19th century artists and painters were altarpieces, triptychs, and these were collected with quite some gusto by the National Gallery and also the Royal Collection. So Prince Albert had great interest in collecting these Byzantine and early Italian altarpieces. And I wanted to show you this one, which was bought in 1849. It's a Duccio altarpiece, so it was quite some excitement about this piece being bought. What this piece does is take the figures from the Bible, so we're clearly looking at the life of Christ. You have the crucifixion there in the central panel, but it devoids them of having any place in space or time. We're supposed to look forward to these figures and to be instilled with the same sort of almost physical pull towards religion and religious beliefs that they were inspiring in the congregations looking at them. Quite a clever aspect of what was instilled in religion in this time is that the power of religion was held with the elite and the learned, who could read the scriptures, and whatever they presented forward to the masses and to the congregation is what was taken as read, because of course most of the congregation was illiterate. So having these figures separated from space and time really helped to elevate them to the sacred status that of course they had. What was going on in the Northern Renaissance in the Middle Ages was a little bit different. And that, I think, is immediately obvious when we look at a triptych from a little bit later, but from the Northern Renaissance, like I said. So this workshop of Robert Campin. Robert Campin was a Netherlandish artist working, as you can see, in the 15th century. And we're absolutely welcomed and invited into this home. The doors are thrown open. It's a domestic scene. We almost feel like we have to bustle in between the angel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary at the scene of the Annunciation, symbolised by those 3 lilies in the jug on the table, to sit ourselves down in front of the fire and be absolutely part of and engaged in this scene. So rather than sacred figures being physically put up on a pedestal, this private triptych to be used in someone's own home, in a home scene similar to the one actually in the painting itself, really invites the viewer in to be part of religion and imagines much more sort of this idea of Christ walking amongst men. And I just wanted to draw your attention to Joseph in his workshop on the right-hand side wing of the triptych here. And you can see this, what is now probably Belgian street, covered in snow, and this idea that the winter is there. So just as we live through the seasons and we can see our streets from our windows, that's exactly how the Christ family lived. And of course, it was in the northern countries of Europe during this time that religion was going through a reformation. Catholicism was being abandoned, and that was in favour of religions where the ordinary people would finally be given access to the book. It was printed in their own languages rather than in an inaccessible Latin, and they were able to take their truth from the word. So this altarpiece sort of fits in with what was going on with religion at that time. This really started off and exacerbated a movement in artwork and with painters that actually the church didn't need to hold the power for art either. And merchant families who were becoming wealthier and wealthier, particularly in these countries, and especially as we move forward into the 16th and 17th centuries, and the Netherlands in particular are starting to trade so widely with the rest of the world that actually it's the wealthy rather than the religious that begin to have the power. Similar things happening through the rest of Europe with the mercantile families such as the Medicis in Florence, but I wanted to focus on the northern countries for obvious reasons, and that is that their depictions of winter from the early 17th century are absolutely beautiful. That leans a lot on social reasons, like I've just said, with ordinary people having money to afford art for their homes, and what they wanted to have in there weren't these great big Catholic depictions of powerful religion. They had the power themselves, and they wanted to explore and entertain that and have these scenes of everyday life, much smaller in scale from the altarpieces that would have adorned churches. And in the early part of the 17th century, another social issue really was the weather. And the Netherlands went through a horrific spell of winters in which lakes would freeze over and people had to really try and go about their ordinary business on the lake. And in this scene, I particularly love that you can see the figures ice skating. They've got their ice skates on, got some chaps down here just getting their boots on and tying them up and going off to play golf, an early form of golf. We also have people sort of roasting chestnuts, people with boats that they obviously can't use, and this really sort of bustling town centre scene. A hint of colour on the horizon in the very white, foggy, misty snow of the winter scene is the new flag of the newly united Netherlands, who had recently broken away from 100 years of Spanish rule after the 100 Years' War. Sorry, forgive me, my computer went a bit haywire then. There we go. So a leap forward in time as well to just before the period that we're interested in, and another Northern European painter, this time a German painter called Caspar David Friedrich. And you can see I've included a quote directly from the artist in this picture, in this depiction of winter, because this is starting to use winter not for its realism, but very much for its symbolism. That's not to say that Friedrich wouldn't have painted winter landscape, a title that gives no real clue to the symbolism in the painting from nature. But what he says there at the bottom is that his paintings are not the faithful representation of air, water, rocks and trees, but the reflection of his soul and the emotion felt in these objects. And what's very clever about this picture is that winter has been used almost as a veil for what's beyond it. So this access to the church and this access to the religion, we can see emerging. It's like an awakening, just the same as the chap in the foreground that we might not see at first has had. He's thrown away his crutches and an apparition of a crucifix has appeared to him in front of these trees as he's been walking through a wintry landscape. And he's been absolutely overcome by a deep spiritualism that he's thrown himself down in front of this crucifix. Winter in this case then indicates that revelation and that coming again and that rebirth, as we know that the snow in this scene will melt away and reveal the beautiful lush green of our spiritual awakening that we can see hinted at in the snow in the foreground. I also think it's very clever that the trees themselves are evergreen, so that's suggesting that even in the deepest winter covered in snow, you can still have your spiritualism because that is evergreen as well. And the fact that this mirrors the church that's sort of appearing like a mirage through the wintry skies as well, with its steeple shape and obviously upward looking to God in heaven. So this is an example of how artists were beginning to use winter as metaphoric really for something other than the season itself. And you can hardly talk about early 19th century winter paintings, or indeed any paintings on the theme of the weather or the natural world, without looking at the work of Joseph William Mallard Turner. And when I was thinking of some wintry paintings to select for this talk, I absolutely had to go for the snowstorm scene with the boat off the harbour's mouth. Like all the great romantic poets and artists in the early 19th century, Turner was amazed by the natural world around him. It was a time when religion was waning, hence the Caspar David Friedrich painting being so important, showing that spiritualism can exist within the sort of natural world and the bleakness of it. But because society was becoming more secular and religion was becoming less important, artists turned to look at nature as, you know, this huge force that somehow couldn't be explained away anymore, and that perhaps gave it more power. The science behind it and the deepening and developing of understanding of the natural world perhaps added to its enormity and its seeming power over mankind, particularly at a time when technology was advancing so much alongside that science and that secularism. And what we have Turner doing here is taking the image of a steamboat and completely turning that into part of this snowstorm. It's almost become the eye of the storm, saying very much that mankind and his inventions might be right at the center of this, but what we're not looking at is the whole, the rest of these powerful natural forces that can so heavily impact upon mankind, and how tiny really mankind is around all this greatness of nature. And this was something that the Romantic poets very much picked up on. But winter in literature goes way back beyond that. And I have this wonderful passage from a Shakespeare poem, Blow, blow, thou winter wind, thou art not so unkind as man's ingratitude. Though thou the waters warp, thy sting is not as sharp as a friend remembered not. And this stirred something in John Everett Millais, as we know, the pre-Raphaelite painter, and he entitled this winter scene after the first line from that Shakespeare stanza. But what it very much picks up on is the last couple of lines in the stanza there. And really, I just adore this painting because we have the dog there being the friend that remembers you even in the bleakest winter. And we see this sort of hint there at poverty, but also Similarly to Turner, you know, you've got the natural world absolutely overwhelming the human characters in it, who are pretty insignificant to the forces of nature going on around it, you know, trying to block themselves against the wind, being completely alone and sort of given up at the side of the road there. But that idea of using winter metaphorically, or of describing the power of nature in winter, definitely resonated with some of the pre-Raphaelite and some of the Victorian poets. So Christina Rossetti, of course, a great poet of the Victorian period, very closely aligned with the pre-Raphaelite movement through her brothers, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the painter, and William Michael Rossetti, the art critic, who were her brothers. And in the Bleak Midwinter, I'm sure is well known to everybody, not just as a poem, but as the wonderful carol sung so frequently at this time of year. And this really, I think, could be a poem that was almost written to illustrate with words the painting we looked at by Friedrich. So it's the idea that even though the winter is bleak, you can still have a heart or a burning fire inside you that becomes your spirituality. And that, of course, is the gift that this poor person, the protagonist in the poem, is due to sort of offer up to the Christ child at this time of year. So really to give up everything else when you have nothing, but what you have to give is still your heart. So that is a really beautiful way of using winter. And I think the language and the use of repetition in this poem is particularly strong and noteworthy. So snow on snow, snow on snow is a beautiful line that really just evokes those images that we've been looking at already in some of the pictures that we've looked at, where, you know, you do get these beautiful different colours of whites in the snow itself. And it's really emphasising the enormity of winter around us. Alfred Lord Tennyson was Poet Laureate for pretty much the whole Victorian period, and his works were absolutely idolised and sensationalised, really, by the Pre-Raphaelites and their followers and further generations, and by other Victorian artists as well. So I only need to say the words Lady of Shalott, and for that to conjure up many, many paintings to everybody, I'm sure, and for that to sort of start to see the impact that his poetry and his writing had on many of the artists of this period. This one, again, I liked it because it had that same repetition that we've just seen in the Rossetti poem. So in the first stanza that we look at here, the frost is here, and fuel is dear, and woods are sere, and fires burn clear, and frost is here, and has bitten the heel of the going year. And that's a very clever verse because it keeps building imagery very, very slowly, almost opaquely, upon the image that we already have, just as snow might fall in blankets. But then we're asked to imagine something more by that being turned into a metaphor. So we have very clear visual language, a fire burning, a frost. But then we have this idea of it biting at the heel of the ongoing year. So it's just very clever language. And I think it's very easy to see why Tennyson was so loved and so used again and again by the Victorian painters who admired his work, because his language does allow for a very visual reading, which of course is essential in painting. Slightly before Tennyson, we have perhaps the most tragically romantic poet of the 18th century, whose story was another great source of inspiration for its great drama to the artists that we're really thinking about today. Chatterton was only 17 when he took his own life. He'd been born in Bristol, moved to London to pursue a career with writing, really wasn't getting anywhere with it, and was living in abject poverty in rented rooms in London, and eventually killed himself. This is a poem of his which picks up on this idea of using the language of winter. And as we saw with Tennyson and Rossetti a little bit, but I think particularly in Chatterton's poem, is that he really does paint a very vivid picture with his language. And the little bit that I will read to you are the two stanzas that we can see there in the middle, because they become very important in the image that I'm going to show you next. Pale rugged winter bending over his tread, his grizzled hair bedrocked with icy dew, his eyes a dusky light congealed and dead, his robe a tinge of bright ethereal blue, his train a mottled sanguine sabled cloud, his limbs along the russet dreary moor, whilst rising whirlwinds blasting keen and loud roll the white surges to the sounding shore. And Henry Wallace, the artist, absolutely was taken with this story of Thomas Chatterton and his sort of very tragic life. And I almost think he must have had this the poem in mind when he painted his sort of very small tribute to Chatterton, which is just after he's killed himself. You can see the vial of poison there directly in the middle on the floor. But here we have ethereal blue. There it is in Chatterton's chaps, his trousers that he's wearing. We have the sanguine cloak, which you can see strewn upon the chair. And we have that deep white that almost looks like a rolling moor that Chatterton's body makes up as it's along that settee. We have the russet of his hair as well. And then the snow out of the window with this open window letting in the cold that's making Chatterton's dead body this steely grey white that almost looks, you know, like purest snow, mimicked in the torn up and scattered pages of Chatterton's wasted talent and his futile attempts to become a poet. So a deeply moving, quite powerful image, all because of that use of colour and that link back to Chatterton's own poem. So a very clever picture indeed that references the winter. Burne-Jones, I'm sure, isn't a stranger to anyone listening today, but Edward Burne-Jones was another incredible artist of the late Victorian period, turning his hand to everything from watercolour to piano decoration. And one art form that he worked in a little bit throughout his career, but very much so at the end of his life, was woodblock prints. And here we have the Summer Snow. The model for this is Jane Morris, wife of Willie Morris, Burne-Jones's colleague in the arts and crafts movement. And even though we have these flowering plants and these beautiful daisies and rich grasses on the bottom, sort of peppered along the grass that Jane Morris is standing on, we can see very clearly that we have snow falling on her. And this woodblock was made to go in the Good Words magazine in 1863, alongside the verse you can see on the left-hand side there. And what's interesting for me about this one is that Burne-Jones actually published it under the name Christopher Jones, Christopher being the name of a baby that Edward and Georgiana Burne-Jones had just lost in infancy. And I think to publish this picture under his name as tribute to him really gets to the heart of what is meant by Summer Snow, to be so lost and absorbed in grief as you see the figure huddled over this tiny book with sort of blocking out anything else going around her. Even this idea that, you know, it can be glorious summer outside, but winter can take over the way you're feeling and give you sort of a very bleak, cold feeling inside. Is exactly summed up by grief. And then to give it a bit of a contemporary feel, just because it reminded me so much of the scene in the Richard Curtis film Notting Hill, for anyone who has seen it, as Hugh Grant's character is walking along Portobello Road Market and the seasons are changing beyond him, but he is completely oblivious to them because he's so heartbroken at having been shunned by his love. So that's just the same idea for me, that we can become so into ourselves that actually it doesn't matter the heat of the season outside, we can be feeling and presenting winter in ourselves. So a very sad and very touching tribute there. So with all that in mind, let's take a jump proper into the winters of the late Victorian period. And I had to start with Ford Madox Brown's The Last of England, painted in tribute to his friend, the sculptor Thomas Woolner, who emigrated to Australia in the year 1854. Madox Brown was interested in him doing that and him up sticks and leaving to go and pursue a career instead and try and find his fortune in the gold mines of Australia. The journey you know, in the mid 19th century, it's absolutely horrific for him. You can see that from this crowded ship that this young couple is sitting on, looking resolutely forward. They're absolutely determined in the voyage that they're going to take as the white cliffs of Dover come away from them into the distance. It's a freezing cold day. We can see that from how well wrapped up the young couple at the front of the picture are, but also everyone else behind them. Cabbages tied to the front of the boat there, their food for this long and arduous journey. And I think, you know, if winter was ever going to be metaphoric for a long period of bleakness before getting to something sunnier on the other side, it's being used to document Woolner's emigration to Australia. And two tiny details that I just wanted to draw your attention to as well were the tiny hand of the baby. So very much as winter comes to spring, we've got that idea of growth and of forward looking, as much as the figures are looking forward. And I really love the hand that's being clutched here. You can really get a sense of just how cold it is with the woman gripping onto her husband's hand. And supposedly Maddox Brown would get his second wife, Emma, who is the model for this painting, to sit outside in the snow so that she would look cold for this picture, so that he could get the colours absolutely right for his painting. And this picture was so well celebrated that other artists used these sort of same visual clues and narratives. And I thought that the Rossetti Brighton and Back was a brilliant example from that, again, from Birmingham Museums Trust. And you can see he's really using winter to advantage here to look at the different textures that wet textiles and knitted textiles and the variety of different textiles make up in this picture. I think that's really clever. And I just adore the chap who's gone to sleep here with a sheet of newspaper on his hat to protect it from the elements. An artist that really used winter to have a socio-political comment is definitely Thomas Kennington. This is just an example of many, many pictures by Kennington that look like this, and you probably don't need me to tell you what's going on. We have a starving and poor family living in abject poverty, a woman with 3 young children there, and her youngest daughter obviously acting as a flower seller, and the picture's punctuated with this yellow and the red of the baby's cloak as well. So yellow for hope and red, of course, for bloodshed and impending death, unfortunately. So a real arresting picture, especially as that young girl looks directly out of us at the canvas. And this is really Kennington using his place as an exhibitor in art galleries, the place of the wealthy, of the bourgeoisie who want to maybe shop for new paintings for themselves, but as they can walk past these people in the street because that's not their place, by putting paintings of exactly what they're ignoring outside on the inside and inviting that narrative into the middle class spaces that they usually wouldn't have to deal with it in. It's actually a very clever thing for Kennington to do, because he's instantly asking the middle classes to take responsibility of their citizenship and to step up and address the need of the poor and the hungry, especially at winter. And the idea that it's this freezing cold winter really does pull on our heartstrings. So whilst using winter in realism in those ways allows us to think about human presence within it, there were artists working in the late Victorian period that were more interested in the exact sort of science behind nature, and looking very closely at that and thinking about snow and ice for the effects of light on it and how that could be used and recycled and reused in painting to brilliant artistic effects. And here we have a minute study of ferns and trees up in Perthshire by John Ruskin. And this minute attention to detail was incredibly important to him, something that he lectured on widely in his theory of art. Ruskin was an art critic. He gave the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood their sort of critical standing, and was a patron to many of them, and really started and kick-started many of their careers. But he was an artist in his own right, and his minute detailed study from nature was absolutely part of his teaching, which he delivered through his position as the Slade Professor of Art at Oxford University. So he was really in a position of power to negotiate and perpetuate his thoughts. He would also travel widely and was very interested in the snow and ice of glaciers in the Alps. So this is a photograph by John Ruskin and his colleague Frederick Crawley from Chamonix, and you can see here that when Ruskin described it as standing in a sea of ice, that is really exactly what was happening. But Ruskin's interest went a little bit further than the artistic elements of nature, as he was an early ecologist with great sensitivity to the natural world and in the environment, and worried greatly about the effects of industrialization, not just on humankind, but on the natural world around him. And one of the pupils that he really instilled that in was John Brett, who followed in his footsteps to accurately depict these beautiful glaciers in the Alps, and he would travel there as well. And I think even though there's an absence of everything we would think of as important in painting, particularly painting from this time. So we think of, it being a medievalism and a story and a dynamism and attaching meaning to it. Whereas actually in these images, you can see that the study of nature itself and how light plays on snow is actually what is most important to the artists, Brett and Ruskin particularly. And with this John Brett picture, he actually wrote in his diary that he had never painted in his life, and fooled and slopped and attempted in a reasonable way to paint all I could see. And I think he's absolutely done that. So it's a very faithful reproduction of nature is what he was saying was important in this picture. Sadly, Ruskin was absolutely correct, and the impact of industrialization on the natural world around us has been absolute, as demonstrated by artist Emma Stibbon's picture of 2018. She was commissioned to take a picture from the same spot Ruskin had travelled to, and whilst Ruskin stood in a sea of ice, Stibbon reported that she was absolutely horrified to arrive there and see nothing but an empty trench of stone looking back at her. So I think it's quite damning really to us to know that 150 years ago Ruskin was waxing lyrical about the effects of industrialization on the environment, and very sadly that has come true. It's not just European artists that I thought was worth considering in this, because as Commodore Matthew Perry opened up trade with Japan in 1853, there was a real surge in cultural and artistic exchange between Japan and European artists. And I think the European artists are just absolutely desperate to get their hands on anything that had been denied to them for so long, even though they'd known it was there. And woodblock prints, being so cheap and easy to transport that long distance, became a great source of inspiration to many European and British artists. Of course, using woodblock means that you have these great expanses where not much colour or texture needs to be put onto the paper, and the colours actually stay the same no matter which plane is being negotiated to us, and our imagination has to fill in quite a lot of the blanks. Particularly a useful tool when the artists were depicting these winter scenes. And I love about this one the fact that again we've got those similar ideas of nature being absolutely overwhelming, particularly in the winter, with this tiny presence of human figures and a great vast whiteness behind us. And when I say the arts, they put each plane together, so we don't get the same sense of background and foreground that we might do in traditional Western painting. We have the foreground stacked up, writing by the artist in these vertical columns, and the same whiteness right in what's supposed to be the foreground as the background. So it's a very squashed sense of space, which is a key and crucial aspect of these woodblock prints, which was taken on and used by European artists. None so much as Claude Monet and other Impressionists. It's called the Impressionists because they were interested in the study of light on nature. And Monet, who spent a couple of months in London to escape the Franco-Prussian Wars between 1870 and 1871, was absolutely taken with the fog in London. So not quite as much sparkling snow, but it still shows that artist relationship with the world around them, and that real interest in looking at light and how light can be changed and refracted through various natural elements. So in this case, fog rather than snow, admittedly. But everything about this painting is new. We've got the new Houses of Parliament, the new Victorian embankment on the right-hand side there, absolutely just being built. So, but the human presence in it is tiny, and it's only hinted at through the dabs of the brush that Monet was absolutely brilliant at from his days as working as a caricaturist. But what we see that's really is what we're sort of forced and encouraged to look at in this painting is exactly this, the beautiful light, rather than the the activity that's going on around it, which is sort of incidental. In a very similar fashion, we have the paintings of James McNeill Whistler, an aesthete, an artist who believed that art should exist for art's sake. So much so that Whistler didn't just see what he was painting and recreate that in stunning beauty for us, but he could hear it. So all of his paintings have these very inventive titles that are taken from musical scores. So here we have a nocturne in grey and gold. And much as Monet was looking at the other effects of light in the city, that's exactly what Whistler was doing in his artworks as well. So this nocturne in grey and gold actually picks up on the different colours of light that one might see if they were walking through Chelsea, which is where he lived, right in an artistic hub in Chelsea as it was in the 1870s. He had a home there and a studio as well. And I think you can, appreciate and agree in this, that looking at the golden glowing lights coming out of the windows, but against the kind of the light that's very specific to snow. So once it snowed, even if it's a dark black day, the light that the snow gives back from being this beautiful blanket of white is absolute. And I think that is captured in the colour of this picture just remarkably. Whistler himself was also influenced by other artists. Artists were always working in and around each other and knew each other and worked in these networks. And Whistler himself said that he thought he was good at capturing light until he saw old Grimmie's pictures. The Grimmie he was referring to was John Atkinson Grimshaw, better known for his pictures of capturing moonlight in city scenes. So this is a little bit different for him. And I think it absolutely recalls the Japanese woodblock print in having this sort of very uniform colour, but with this tiny human presence in it, so that we can really start to appreciate the enormity of the weather on a singular person there. As they disappear over this lip, we know we're going to be left with this beautiful blanket of white. But even within that, he's used a great amount of colour. You can see the spectrum of that across the page, from the earthy orange tones to the bright blue. But only when you're really thinking to look for it do you see how light looks on white snow, because your brain tricks you into understanding the scene as just being white. But actually, it's an incredibly colourful picture if you look carefully at it. A completely different way of looking at winter is to personify winter as a woman and have her there to be objectified and purely to be beautiful. So another aesthetic take on winter, but very, very different from being concerned about the effects of the natural world and the interplay of humans and light on the natural forces. So here we have Walter Crane's A Masque for the Four Seasons, and depicting the four seasons as women was just something that everyone was up to, really. I could have picked an example of this from many, many artists, but you'll also recall the very first slide I showed you of the mosaic with the decoration of the four seasons. So this is something that's quite a classical idea, and like I said, they're just to be decorative, really, and beautiful. But you can see what Crane's done here is use the arms of the women linked together to show this linear movement from spring through summer to autumn, there with her sunflowers and the ripe fruit in the tree above her, to winter, who of course is portrayed as an older woman, and she has the little hourglass at her foot there, indicating that passing of time. This slide for Winter as a Woman could have come into the next section about symbolism As well, it's Evelyn de Morgan's The Cadence of Autumn. So again, we've got the 4 seasons, spring through to winter. But what I liked about this one, in contrast to Crane's depiction of the seasons, is that actually we don't get a linear movement with de Morgan, we get a cycle. So as you look at the image, you have spring moving through to summer, to winter, but then it's actually an upwards ascension for winter. And you see these beautiful mists moving forward and upwards. And as they do so, the trees bend back towards spring as spring's branches reach towards winter. So this is actually a very symbolic picture that asks us to consider that time isn't linear, but rather cyclical. And of course, that fit in with Evelyn de Morgan's ideas as a spiritualist, that at the death of the human body, the spirit would be reincarnated or would continue on to the next life. I also wanted to include a pastel study for the figure of winter in this, because that strips all of the symbolism away from it, and we can understand de Morgan as a very rigorous portrait painter. Actually not a painting, this is a pastel study in which she's used the tone and colour of the brown paper to build up the layers of colour in the woman's face, and it really makes the face pop from the picture, and it's a very powerful pastel study. Could be an artwork in its own right, even though it was a preparatory drawing. So finally, symbolic seasons. Like I said, the last slide could have fit into this category as well, so it's a nice segue. This is a painting in watercolour by Marie Spartalis-Silman, another sort of one of these artists described as a second wave and pre-Raphaelite. And The Enchanted Garden is a wonderful story that was taken on by a number of artists. And it's from the last day of Boccaccio's Decameron, when we have this sort of unwavering love that a nobleman of Udine, who's there on the right hand side, has for Dianora, who's the figure there with the furs on. And to try and get him to leave her alone, she says, well, if you can conjure me a spring garden in the middle of winter, then you can continue your advances, but if not, then it's all called off. And you can see the shock and amazement on all these people's faces, as that is exactly what happens in this beautiful garden is conjured up, and that really takes our attention. But then if we look through the arches behind it, you can see that what's real in this picture is the winter outside of the magical garden. And I love that she's included the cherry blossom tree there, which almost of course looks like snow when that falls. So we have a real interplay there between what's real and what's magical, and the overall feel is a sort of wonderfully enchanted piece of artwork. I'm going to leave you with the painting that sort of inspired me to put this talk together, because I think the use of snow in this painting to be symbolic of purity and of innocence is absolutely arresting and completely powerful. This painting's at Tate Britain. It's in the Pre-Raphaelite Gallery, Gallery 9 at Tate Britain. It's quite a big picture. And what we have is this young woman dead on the floor in front of us, with the snow starting to sort of cover her up and bury her, as the clothes that she's wearing are not doing. So we have these swirling robes on the floor, and her swirling hair in a like blood red colour across her body. It almost looks like she's floating in water or on air, representing the sort of otherworldliness of her body. And the figure we're looking at is Saint Eulalia, as you can see, so was martyred for her allegiance to Christianity, her refusal to worship Roman gods at the age of 12. And the death that she suffered was absolutely horrific, so horrific that Waterhouse has chosen not to depict it in his painting at all. Her body was ripped apart by 2 iron hooks, and her breasts were set on fire. So the idea that the snow then came and fell over the top of her, in the legend or the retelling of this story of Saint Eulalia, the idea is that her body was then blanketed and covered with something pure and white. So whilst that's maybe missing, I think probably Waterhouse couldn't bring himself to put something as horrific as that down on paper. And of course, the opportunity to display a beautiful and attractive woman would have resonated with him as well. And so even though the scene is set in ancient Rome, and we have a sort of gladiator figure there coming along, and we've got the cross as the sign of the crucifix, indicating that that is maybe how she was martyred, is all these clues and symbols to understanding that as being Saint Eulalia, but the snow in that case becomes completely important, because it's that idea that someone so young should be so violently killed for her beliefs is shocking, and deserves the snow to fall over it and blanket it in beautiful whiteness. Oh, and yes, there we go. That brings us to the end. So I hope you've seen then that through sort of a historic overview of an overview of historic art and literature, and what was coming immediately before this sort of period of late Victorian painting, that actually there were traditions that were kept and upheld, but a very new way of looking at snow and understanding it is to paint it very carefully and very accurately, and to be able to understand what the different ways of portraying it in paint were, and how the light and how nature affected it. Thank you very much.